Welcome to the American Institute of Healthcare Professionals videogram on the role of social influence and psychology on moral actions. And this video is with our Christian counseling program, in particular with SC 580. And it's also really a continuation of our earlier video on Christian morality itself. And it's a take from a more psychological perspective. So it's building upon it. For review, real quick though, what is a moral act in moral theology? So when we look at any human action, we see a moral act when it goes beyond just mere survival, when it has sentient implications to it. And by sentient, I mean the ability to analyze, understand consequences, and so forth. So theology, the highest of all sciences, gives qualitative and objective value to the human act and as well as the moral act itself. But psychology helps us understand the human agent's role in the act from an inner perspective, from a physiological perspective. So since all moral acts are derived from spiritual and sentient beings, and because we as spiritual beings are also composed of matter, there is a combination. So psychology helps us understand, and biology helps us understand the inner workings of the body and how those inner influences dictate our spiritual attitudes at times. So when we look at the moral act, we're looking at the action itself, the agent committing the act, the circumstances, and those things surrounding it. The moral action will either be considered moral or immoral, sinful or not sinful, or it'll be a virtuous habit or a viceful habit in itself. But the agent, which is the person committing the act, is very subjective in cases regarding moral acts. Their culpability or guilt can be increased or decreased based on their knowledge, their intent, their freedom, and a variety of chemical, physical, and psychological factors, which are going to be the primary emphasis of today's video. It's important, though, to understand that despite all these subjective aspects, the objective nature of the act is either right or wrong. It cannot be altered. Just the culpability of the agent committing the action can be lessened or increased in itself. So with the psychological implications that we're going to look at that we see in post-fall humanity, we want to understand again that before the fall of Adam, humanity had control of their passions. They had great knowledge and they were able to access their brain without any issue. They were able to control their hormones. The neurotransmitters within their bodies were in complete balance. They were guided with the virtue of temperance and guided with great wisdom. But after this fall, things became more messy. It became more complicated. So what we may will or what we may desire from our spiritual aspects can be greatly affected by our physiology and our connection with our body. So we can be affected through hunger, we can be affected through anger, and these things have neurological effects within our body that can make us, not make us, but basically influence us to be more easily pushed in a different direction than maybe our spiritual self wants to go. So if we look just at the brain itself, aggressive criminals are known to possess less developed frontal lobes. And if certain parts of the brain are removed, they become less aggressive. So the brain, obviously, in this regard, plays a role in aggression. The hypothalamus activates the pituitary gland, which dictates the fight or flight response. So when a stressor occurs or we have to do something, there are chemical changes taking place within our body that are going to affect how we spiritually interpret things. Also, this is seen with neurotransmitters. In between the neurons, there are electrical impulse charges that fire off, that produce chemicals that help us maintain a certain balance in our emotional state itself. So those with balanced serotonin levels, they are going to be much more happier and focused. But those with imbalance in serotonin, they may be more prone to depression. And obviously, a depressed individual is going to also be spiritually depressed due to the physical manifestation. So various neurotransmitters such as dopamine or epinephrine or serotonin play big and important roles in how we feel emotionally as well as spiritually. The amygdala itself is a center for emotional arousal. And when something fires through our senses that is emotionally charged, that is maybe even very traumatic, it usually fires through the amygdala first, which is referred to as the short road, and it takes away much of our intellectual reasoning in deciphering a situation. So we respond more emotionally, more angry maybe, or more in denial or lost for words. So without the intellectual capability to be able to discern a situation, the amygdala responds emotionally, and this can affect culpability in a moment of passion, so to speak. And obviously, finally, hormones. Hormones are different than neurotransmitters because they're secreted from glands, but they can also increase our passions, our moments, our sexual drives, which again, sexual immorality is part of the human acts, and they are sinful, some of them outside of marriage. So when an individual is filled with these hormones, obviously, it is something to consider in the human act because the soul, again, is unable to regulate as much as it would without this extra little whisper and push from the hormones. Now, again, all of these things that are occurring within the brain, within the mind, within the blood and the neurotransmitters and the hormones, all of these things do not dictate a free pass to commit wrong actions, but they help us understand why certain behaviors are the way they are. Now, from a social psychological standpoint, these behaviors can also have real effects within us on how, as a human species, we respond and react. Again, none of these things overtake one's free will. None of these things validate immoral deeds, but they help us understand why some individuals can fall prey as social creatures who seek conformity, sometimes at a subconscious level. So the power of blending in, as well as the neuro and the biology we studied, the power of just socially wanting to blend in as a human species is very, very powerful. One example of this is with Stanley Milgram's experiments on conformity to authority. And in his experiments, which were very controversial, an individual was placed in one room and another supposed individual was placed in another room, and they were separated by a wall. And they were both told by a source of authority, the psychologist, that both had willingly entered into this to this experiment. And what one was to do was to press a button which would emit an electrical pulse, which would then shock the individual in the other room. So upon doing so, if a wrong answer was recited by the other person in the room who was to be shocked, the psychologist would tell the person to shock that other person. So with the first try, the person was shocked, and it was not that traumatic, but upon sequential missed questions, the shock voltage went up. So as each time the individual was told to shock the other person in the other room supposedly would make a louder sound of pain. And as time went on, it got worse and worse. So some individuals would start to question, should I keep doing this? This is hurting the other person, because the other person would scream, stop, and so forth. But the psychologist would continue to tell the individual to keep shocking. Out of the percentage of individuals who partook in this, 60% kept shocking until they were told not to. Now, the good news is no one was really on the other side of the wall. No one was being hurt. But what it did show was that individuals will sometimes keep doing something, even though they feel that it's wrong, if a strong source of authority pushes them to do so, even if it is against their moral judgment to do so. And this explains a lot of the problems we see when totalitarian governments take over. Nazi Germany, the communism in Russia, and even in North Korea, how individuals will forfeit their morality and obey a certain authority, even if it goes against what they think is right. Now, Solomon Asch also did a couple of experiments with certain lines and how the ones were shorter or longer, and usually the groups would be in 3 to 5. And first they would be shown individually, which were the correct answers to the particular puzzles. And then when they were grouped together, they would purposely add an individual who would say the wrong thing. And they would add a second and third. And when it came to the individual who was being tested, the individual felt the need to question his own rightful judgment and then conform to that of the others. So in this way, Solomon Asch showed how peer pressure can affect one to go against what they know is right or feel is the correct answer just for conformity. And in many cases, again, it was around 60%, they were siding with the majority due to insecurity or fear of incompetence. Now, there are other types of psychological things that can play a role in making individuals do things that are against their own internal compass. A social contagion is one, where an individual brings in a bad idea or a bad moral act, and what is seen is that usually one can eventually corrupt the whole. And this is seen also in moral theology with the occasion of sin. When you start to influence something that is against the good norm, eventually it can weaken the resistance to that particular behavior. Also, like-minded groups become more polarizing as they come together. So whether you have a very devout Christian group coming together, or you have a bunch of skinhead Nazis coming together, if the group is more like-minded, they will tend to become more extremist in their thought process as one collective unit, which can be usually not a good thing, especially if you're using the skinhead or the Nazi example itself. In cases of Christianity and piety, that can be good unless you start going down a darker nationalistic type Christian thought process with that. Now, how do individuals come to accept these changes, in the 60%? How do they come about and justify their change in morality against their own beliefs to satisfy the needs of the many? And a term that is used in psychology is cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance refers to a justification of when one's values and actions do not meet. So if one's actions are in contrary to one's belief systems, there has to be a way that the individual can come to terms with it. So the conscience in moral theology is really bugging the individual, and 40% of the individuals usually will listen to their conscience, but a high percentage has to feel the need to feel justified. So they'll either use a particular justification, such as maybe this person deserved it, and this is why I went along with the others, or it's not really my fault. And a good example of that would be Nazi prison guards, maybe, who say, well, I'm just doing my job. I'm being ordered. I have to put food on the table. But the closer you get to the act, the greater the dissonance. So from a Nazi guard to maybe the Nazi who imprisons the Jewish population, to the Nazi who actually pulls the trigger. So you're going to have more dissidence as you get closer to the locus of the moral action itself. So I think that is important to understand how people attempt to justify what they do. And I think the scary thing is that when evil times occur, usually the worst of individuals will come out because of this need to conform. So those who are more neutral, not as strongly moral, if the majority is a certain way, they're more likely to be more easily persuaded. And again, we've seen that so much throughout history, and we wonder how a large population can follow someone such as an Adolf Hitler and so forth. And these are ways that morality can be corrupted itself. Now, in addition, there is the case of aggression, and aggression occurs quite frequently, obviously. It's one of the first sins that we see when Cain killed Abel, and it's purposely looking to hurt someone mentally or physically. And in post-fall reality with Adam, we have lost control of our passions, and individuals can fall victim to anger very easily. So the agent's culpability can lessen due to frustrations, irritabilities, and other external factors. They can also have various chemical imbalances, neurological imbalances, as well as genetic predispositions. But many criminals have a lot of these problems, and this is why it's important that when these individuals commit these crimes, that they are punished, but also attempted to be rehabilitated because of some of the mental issues that are associated with the crime that they committed. The good news is our human nature might have been damaged, but it wasn't completely destroyed. We're still made in the image and likeness of God, and we are inclined to good. And social psychology, while it shows that some go the other way, there are also pushes towards the majority to do good as well. Because we are social beings, we need to work together. And kindness and helping each other are keys for the species' overall survival. We have John Stuart Mill talking about utilitarianism. And also we have the social exchange theory. And with John Stuart Mill and utilitarianism, referring to whatever can produce the greatest good is the action that one should take. Social exchange theory deals more that it is most beneficial for individuals to help each other because there's that natural benefit for the whole. So there is a collective idea. And I think this is where the golden rule emerges, where it's do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Now, there is also a social responsibility norm with that, where one feels this type of obligation to do what is right for the whole, and also a term known as reciprocity of norm, where we can pretty much believe that if someone helps one other person, that other person is naturally going to want to help them back. Now, once we look at this, we also see where and how detrimental antisocial disorders can be, such as narcissism and unofficial titles of sociopathy and psychopathy, where consciences are completely devoid and the individuals are only working for their own good and they don't play by the rules. So antisocial disorders are an extreme issue. Also, because antisocial disorders are not connected to neurotransmitters or anything like that. They're more behavioral, and they're due maybe to trauma at a younger age, and they completely rewire the brain itself. So a lot of these ideas, these theories of good, of helping each other, is what Christ taught. Christ taught us to help others and to love one another and to see Christ in others. So through helping others, through the corporal and spiritual works of mercy, we're not only helping survive as a species collectively, but we're also fulfilling Christ's command. And it's an intrinsic reward, not an extrinsic one where survival of the species is found, but we're doing it because Christ tells us to do so. And that's reward in itself, to do what is right. And this is where we come to standing out of the crowd, Christian moral virtue. Despite all of the subjective inner workings of our body, we are still called to stand outside the crowd as Christians. The excellence of Christ and the saints show heroic virtue when standing against the majority, especially when evil emerges. We see this with the martyrs. We see this with individuals who are within society today who stand out against their immorality, despite the fear maybe of being branded as politically incorrect. So while there are many inner whispers, uncontrolled passions, and peer pressures that help understand why it's difficult to do what is right, and sometimes even understandable, we're still, as Christians, as disciples of Christ, called to do what is right when it is most difficult. And I believe that is called the virtue of temperance, to proceed forward with fortitude, not temperance, but with fortitude. Fortitude allows us to suffer things unjustly and to push forward in itself, the virtue of fortitude. So we are commanded to do what is right no matter the challenge, and we should imitate Christ and the saints in that. Because when good men do nothing, or good people do nothing, evil will always triumph. So I'd like to thank you for listening. We offer here our Christian counseling certification. There's our link. Our number is 330-652-7776, and our email is info@AIHCP.org. As Christians, we need to do what is right, and that can sometimes be difficult. We have a lot of inner wiring, but we need to overcome those things, and we need to proceed forward. Through Christ, all is possible. Thanks for listening, and have a good day.